Testing 1 2 1 2.
Wow, that is a fire.
Ooh, jeez, that's hot. Mendel.
Adam.
This is Future Ecologies.
On vacation.
We are back at base camp for our annual,
semi-annual
summit meeting. And normally when we are here in the off season, we like to feature episodes of podcasts we really like. But today we are doing something different. Today we are premiering a piece of original audio, not from another podcast feed, but from the UBC Center for Climate Justice.
Mendel and I think of what we do here as mostly art, but it's also a bit of science and a bit of journalism, maybe a bit of science journalism.
Yeah.
And so we spent a fair amount of time thinking about both of those things. And they have some similarities, right? They're both primarily concerned with uncovering the truth in a way. And both science and journalism have historically been really concerned with this idea of objectivity, right? Of like an objective observer that can then deliver us the truth. And, you know, that idea is complicated, especially in journalism, but increasingly in science, right? The idea that it actually matters who is doing the observing and what questions they're asking, right? In terms of what results we're going to get and what the truth is going to look like. In science, as in journalism, we now acknowledge that the observer is actually affecting whatever they're observing, right? They're having an impact on the thing that they are trying to understand. What this piece is asking is what kind of impact is what we're observing having on us as scientists or as journalists. And in the case of a lot of these students, both.
We're going to hand it off to Judee Burr and Naomi Klein to take it from here. So, from the UBC Center for Climate Justice, this is The Right to Feel.
Hi, Naomi.
Hi, Judee.
I wanted to start by briefly introducing this podcast series. For many of our listeners, you need no introduction, but to introduce you in the context of the work we'll hear in this podcast, Naomi Klein is a professor at the University of British Columbia's Geography Department, an award-winning author, including of the recent book Doppelganger, an award-winning journalist, and co-founder of UBC's Center for Climate Justice. My name is Judee Burr. I'm a graduate student in the Department of Geography, and I took your class called Ecological Affect in the fall of 2022. And in that class, you brought us graduate students together to think through and, more importantly, feel through our experiences of climate change. We talked and wrote about the emotionality of grappling with the changes we're living through here on unceded Musqueam territory in the Pacific Northwest, and the changes we're witnessing in other geographies around the world. The writings that we did in your class became the impetus for making this audio story. Can you start by telling me more about designing the class and the experience of teaching it?
Sure, and thank you, Judee. So this course, which as you said is called Ecological Affect, but its unofficial name was Climate Feelings, and I designed it in conversation with my collaborator and research assistant, Kendra Jewell. And what we were specifically thinking about was the work of young scientists and scholars who are immersed in studying various aspects of the climate crisis. What we know is that these researchers who are studying extinction, who are studying habitat loss and glacier loss, live in the same world that we all live in, which is a world that is very much on fire. So that work is necessarily deeply emotional. But the academy, the academic world in which they're being trained, often doesn't have much room to recognize those kinds of emotional impacts. And I remember really being struck by this in 2021 when there was a devastating heat wave in British Columbia, and just seeing these reports that were quoting young scientists, many of them still students, and what they were doing was cataloging mass human and non-human death because of this so-called heat dome. And what became clear is that these scientists were essentially working as undertakers for many different kinds of life being lost to the climate crisis. And that was something that I had witnessed before in my reporting. I had seen young scientists doing desperately sad work cataloging extinction in the Great Barrier Reef in Australia in the midst of a mass die-off, or in the Gulf of Mexico on research vessels in the midst of the BP oil disaster. Scientific research requires a kind of distancing and compartmentalizing when you're doing the work, but it really had me wondering what happens to those feelings. These young researchers are not robots, and many of them went into this work because they have a deep love of the natural world. So I had been thinking for a long time that we need more spaces or containers to explore the affective side of difficult climate research. And that's what this class was really designed to be, one of those spaces where we could engage with those feelings. And I want to be clear, and we talked about this in the very first class, Judee, that often when we think about climate emotions, people immediately go to grief, anxiety, rage, and we do all of that in the course, but we also look at love and solace, and the positive emotions that come out when we work in the natural world. So I think it's important for all of our mental health not to pretend that we are detached, to acknowledge that we all have skin in the game. I think it makes us better researchers. I don't think it compromises us. I think it makes us better colleagues and generally better human beings, and that is going to help improve our chances of building the kind of countervailing forces that are required to have thriving futures. So that's what it was all about for me.
Yes, that really came through in being in the class, and I really appreciated that space that you created. It felt like everyone was eager for it. And talking about this now hits hard. Last summer, I just felt devastated witnessing the effects of extreme heat, again, drought, and wildfire in our region of so-called British Columbia. I've been studying land governance and environmental history and fire-prone geographies. And then in 2021 and 2022, I made a podcast about the history of living with fire in the Okanagan Valley in the southern interior of BC. And so then this past summer of 2023, I was watching the news from Vancouver as the McDougall Creek fire swept into West Bank First Nation, West Kelowna, and Lake Country in the Okanagan. It sent more than 10,000 people evacuating and destroyed homes. It was devastating to witness. And I think that's the one that hit me particularly hard last summer because I knew people there. I was texting them. I'd been studying fire there. But it was just one of the many fires in what was, we now know, the most destructive fire season ever recorded in Canada. The evacuations from Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories were happening at the same time. And this was all just weeks after the hurricane-fueled wildfire in Lahaina, Hawaii, killed at least 100 people, making it the deadliest wildfire in a century in the U.S. And so just thinking about all of this in the context of last summer's fire season and how it just felt terrible. And in thinking with our class, I'm trying to just sit with how bad that feels as a way of staying in the present moment and grappling more fully with what's happening and thinking that those feelings can kind of keep me engaged and keep me motivated to dream up a different world.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Judee. It reminds me, it takes me back to the class and how I was often struck, this was a very international group. There are very few of the graduate students are actually from British Columbia. And many of them, I think, like you, part of the reason why you ended up in British Columbia is because it's a very beautiful place. I mean, we're surrounded by natural beauty, but there's a phrase that I've used, and maybe you remember me saying it in class, BC breaks your heart, because we're so close to it. But, what draws us there, and I include myself in it, I'm a latecomer to British Columbia. My parents moved here when I was in university, and I just fell in love with it and decided to move here too. The mountains, the ocean, these incredibly rich Indigenous cultures. But we are witnessing the collapse of the salmon stocks and, this keystone species that so much depends upon. So, what you're describing is, you should feel it. It's healthy to feel that. That's why you do what you do. And we have to stay in touch with it. The summer that you're describing, I think, is the summer when a lot of people started paying attention to Canadian wildfires, because, of course, the smoke rolled in south of the border and even reached New York City. That was Ontario wildfire smoke, but suddenly it was international news, because that's what happens when the Brooklyn Bridge is coated in Canadian wildfire smoke or choked in it. I wrote a piece in 2017. It's the first time I really tried to grapple with what it feels like to live in this very flammable, increasingly flammable landscape. Every summer it seems like the fires get worse. In 2017, I wrote a piece called, the original title was Summer of Smoke. Then I think it was changed to Season of Smoke. And I wrote this line that I've thought about often, which is, it begins to strike you how precarious it all is, this business of not being on fire. And what I was trying to capture there is this feeling of flammability. You can smell it in the air, and you really start to feel like it could happen anytime. I hate to even articulate this, but I sometimes feel like all of our homes are just on loan from the flames.
Yeah, and something I've learned from Indigenous fire keepers and knowledge keepers and fire historians who've studied this is just how unreasonable of an expectation it is to live in this part of the world and expect that we could have a smoke-free or a fire-free life here. But thankfully, a lot of people also have good ideas about how to make those fires less disastrous and how to bring back fire at the right times of year. Something else that struck me in our class and in curating this audio story is the way that we foregrounded climate justice, how climate change exacerbates inequality and injustice and needs to be understood in connection to structures of capitalist and colonial power that have created it. The way we paid attention to power in this class also encouraged us to pay close attention to each of our positions in relation to these structures. That's something you cultivated quite intentionally in our work. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it'd be difficult for me not to. This is sort of how I came to really engage with the reality of climate change. I'm somebody whose work has focused on what I call disaster capitalism, and how in the midst of crisis and shocks, we often see inequalities deepen. And climate disasters are no different. They follow the fault lines of race and class and gender and physical and mental disability and hierarchy that already divide and scar our world. But at the same time, and this is, I think, what has kept me in this struggle, because that's all very depressing, is that the flip side of that is I really deeply believe that meeting the enormous challenges of the climate crisis means an opportunity to heal some of those wounds. In fact, I think it's the only way that we can rise to the systemic crisis that we're in, or the overlapping and systemic crises. So we designed a syllabus that is filled with great writing from many positionalities. Black and Indigenous poets and scholars like Leanne Simpson and Ross Gay, essayists like Keo McClear and Julian Aguan. And I am a very firm believer that nothing inspires good writing like good reading and good writers. So my favorite part of the course really was witnessing how these beautiful writers helped so many of you access new and different registers for your own voices. I think it was a safe place to experiment with voice, and the results were incredible.
It was really inspiring. And as we'll hear in this episode and the next, many of the excerpts that students will share today were inspired by specific pieces of writing, and they'll mention those in the introductions to their excerpts. So in this two-part audio story, we have a gathering of writing on climate feelings. We asked some of the students from the class to record excerpts of the writing and reflections. These pieces take us through many kinds of emotions, from grief and fear of climate change and its uneven impacts to loving observance of the beauty and complexity of the places and planet we share. These authors all have something to say about what it feels like to build a life here and now as climate change is happening. This first episode is Climate Feelings, which gathers writings and reflections on climate change in this present moment, including some examples of students thinking about alternative names for the so-called Anthropocene. We called those the Age of pieces as alternatives to the Age of the Anthropocene. The second episode is called Eulogies. This is a gathering of fictional pieces that we wrote as part of a final assignment. And in that assignment, you asked us to eulogize something that could be lost to the climate crisis and then write a fictional forward-looking account of how that loss was avoided or mitigated. And this was an exercise in thinking about what we love and could lose, and then strategically how to imagine opportunities to build a different future together. Naomi, is there anything else that you'd like to share with our listeners as they go on this audio journey with us?
Just that I'm so happy to have a chance to share some of this wonderfulness with you. Teaching this seminar really was a joy, and the best part of the course was how interdisciplinary it was. So I really want to stress this, that we had graduate students that came from zoology who were studying extinction crises in caribou and bees. We had physics students doing glacier modeling, and geography students like you, Judee, studying fire, and anthropologists studying New Age conspiracy theories. And we all learned so much from each other. Academics often complain about grading. You'll often hear professors talk about grading as like the worst time in the semester. I had the absolute opposite experience with this seminar. I loved getting these essays, particularly the longer ones that you just described, where different futures were imagined. And I often had this feeling while I was reading them that I cannot keep this to myself. That would be much too selfish. And these are too remarkable. So, more than once I wept, particularly while reading these imagined futures. And I always hope to find a way to share the work more widely. So I'm so grateful to you, Judee, that you have woven together these podcast episodes where listeners are going to hear some highlights from our class.
Naomi, thanks for teaching this class and for talking about it with me.
Thanks, Judee.
This first episode is called Climate Feelings. It includes 3 parts. Part 1, Connections. Part 2, Changes. And Part 3, Names for a New Age. In this episode, we will hear excerpts from the writings of Ali Tafreshi, Foster Salpeter, Sara Savino, Annika Ord, Ruth Moore, Nina Robertson, Felix Giroux, Melissa Plisic, and Maggie O'Donnell. We begin with 3 pieces of reflective writing that center on connection and care in a changing world. Here's part 1, Connections.
My name is Ali. I'm a PhD student working on evolutionary theory at the Biodiversity Research Center at UBC. This is a reading inspired by Robin Wall Kimmerer's word for replacing it with respectful language, kin or ki, that acknowledges the animacy all around us. The writing is about 2 kin that I often visit, a pier and a pair of trees in Jericho. If you walk to Jericho Beach from 4th Street, there is a grass field at the entrance where 2 willow trees hung out by themselves, always looking well put together, even at night. My afternoon breaks were walking in between them with my coffee and back to my house. The pier and the 2 trees were broken in the same storm this winter. For my birthday this year, the pier was filled with logs and concrete slabs of the walkway that had been ripped out. Each section of the wooden railing held memories and rituals, none of which were there anymore. I went through the broken pieces of wood, but I couldn't tell apart which piece held what memory and which piece I was supposed to do my hello goodbye ritual with. I sat on top of the backrest of my usual bench and got comfy with the concrete leaning on key. I drank my tea, breathed in, and accepted the wind. The wind accepted me too, which I was grateful for. Regardless, it felt like my birthday at the pier. It's nice to be there with friends when things are different and it's difficult, even if you don't know what to do in that moment. In that way, it's just nice to know our relationship is real, and after a couple of laughs and sips of tea, the broken concrete and logs are just where we are right now. When I first saw the 2 fallen willows and stood still by them with my coffee, an elderly lady came and stood close by. We stood there silently. She walked closer and looked at me. She told me in small sentences that this is as sad as it feels. Like she knew I needed validation. I didn't say anything. I smiled. She stood for a little while more, then left. The next day, Jericho was flooded. The pond with the beavers and ducks had taken over the whole park. It looked magical. I walked with my coffee to see what was happening from all angles. Near when I was about to leave, I was taking a picture of a tree that looked different that day, surrounded by water. When I put my phone down, an elderly lady was standing next to me, wearing a bright yellow poncho and holding a rainbow umbrella. She confirmed how beautiful it is. She then stood there and looked at the landscape with me. She told me she's been coming to Jericho for 20 years and has never seen it like this. She said it's beautiful and the ducks seem to love it, but these changes will destabilize this habitat. This is climate change, she said, smiling while looking down. She was sad, but she was there with her park. She then, in her yellow rain boots, walked into the water that had overtaken the walkways.
This is Foster Salpeter, and I'm a graduate student in political theory, having just completed an MA thesis on non-sovereign approaches to food security. This is a reading from a reflection on the connection to place. Alexis Bonagovsky, a goat farmer and environmentalist from southeastern Montana, provides a genuine account of connection to place. Talking about deer hunting, Bonagovsky says, quote, "You just watch these huge herds come through, and you know that they've been doing that for thousands and thousands of years. And you sit there and you feel connected to that." Bonagovsky then draws a relation between, quote, that connection to this place and the love that people have for it. As extractive industries tear through the region, Bonagovsky is convinced that it, quote, is not the hatred of the coal companies or anger, but love that will save that place. My rootedness to place passes through my canoe. For as long as I can remember, since my earliest days at the canoe club, the perfect canoe stroke has been described to me as one that connects with the water. Often, when we do something or hear something repeatedly, we can lose sense of its meaning. I think this is why the significance of this language only dawns on me now. Why is it that we describe a canoe stroke in this way? For the amateur canoeist, the intention of the stroke is often seen as an attempt to pull water backwards as a way of propelling the boat forwards. In order to perfect the canoe stroke, a reorientation is required. The intention of the stroke is not to propel water backwards. Rather, the goal is to root the blade of the paddle as firmly as possible in the water, and then to pull yourself, bringing the boat with you towards that anchored point, eventually gliding beyond it. In order to achieve this, the paddler has to create the strongest possible connection between boat, body, arms, hands, paddle, and water. Establishing this connection has a particular feeling and sound that practiced paddlers seek out. For auditory reference, a coach once instructed me to listen for and to recreate a puck sound as I paddled down the lake. In a given year, I aim to paddle around 4,500 kilometers. At a comfortable pace, traveling 1 kilometer takes about 200 strokes. This adds up to 900,000 strokes per year. I see that as 900,000 opportunities per year to connect with the water. Sometimes, on a calm day with good visibility, I can achieve a unique sensation that I cherish immensely. After thousands of consecutive strokes, when a practice becomes quite meditative, and the movement mostly subconscious, it can begin to feel as though my paddle's point of anchor is larger than one particular spot in the water. As I fall on the blade of my paddle and draw myself towards it, it is as though I'm being supported by the body of water in its totality. I have paddled and trained everywhere from pristine lakes to brackish lagoons to industrial canals and even the Harlem River in New York City. I promise, this described sensation remains the same on all of these bodies of water. They are all kin, and they are all equally deserving of love.
My name is Sara, and I research the impacts of deforestation on the relationships between humans and elephants in India. This is an excerpt from my reflection on the lessons I've learned from my grandfather about hope. I spent my early summers climbing my granddad's fig trees. They're his pride and joy and grow on a small sunny plot in the south of Italy. My grandfather would wake up at 5 a.m. most days to sneak in a good few hours on the land before it would get too hot to work. A lifetime of making time for what he loves has made him strong, joyful, and silly, even at 96, even as my grandmother's death has uprooted him to the north of the country, and even as rising temperatures scorch his now mostly abandoned land. In Ash Sanders's Under the Weather, Chris Foster proposes ignorance as a word for returning from a state of consciousness to a willed state of not knowing. I would like a word for the reverse, too. A word for the moment you can no longer ignore the emotional weight of climate change, when you first reach that state of consciousness, the moment the veil is lifted and you let yourself feel it all. Revelos? COVID lifted that veil for me. In the early stages of the pandemic, it felt like we might collectively be reminded that humans are part of a complex web of reciprocal relationships and be forced to reckon with the weight of that responsibility. When the global consequences of COVID quickly aligned themselves according to the usual class, racial, and gender divides, my mental health plummeted. Being isolated didn't help, and worrying about my friends and family did not help either. Ultimately, however, it was a realization that this too would be insufficient for us to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves, as Arundhati Roy beautifully describes it, the dull but burgeoning sense of hope. I don't think it's a coincidence that those who experience deteriorating mental health as a result of climate change are ignored, belittled, or patronized, that the words to describe these experiences do not really exist. Depression, anxiety, rage, fear, grief, they're more than justified responses to what is happening. They're acts of resistance in a culture that is trying to tell us we are selfish and caring and ultimately alone. Back to my grandfather. He's a man of few words and would never proselytize for his belief that connection to the land, reciprocity, getting your hands dirty, literally and figuratively, are a balm for the aches that most of us are going through right now. As an illiterate immigrant who built a life for his family in what was, at the time, an especially underserved part of Western Europe, his life speaks to those Randian virtues of reason, purpose, and self-esteem. And yet, he is a passionate proponent of a government that fulfills its social contract with its people, for a society that is built around abundance, that incentivizes love and care. My grandfather is preparing for death. He's asked us to plant a fig tree in our much colder garden in Belgium. This small transplant will have to get used to a new climate, but should it survive, it'll ensure that his values find roots somewhere long after he dies. I want a word for the radical healing that comes from living a life aligned with your values, as much as feasible in a broken system. From planting small seeds that might not change everything all at once, what will, but that might help tip the scales ever so slightly in favor of a world different from the one our neoliberal gods have designed for us. Avant-gardening?
As Naomi described in the introduction, this class encouraged us to put into words the complex emotions evoked by climate change. Yes, this includes sorrow and anxiety, but also anger, wonder, appreciation, and love for our changing human and more than human ecological communities. Now we'll hear selections from students' reflections on the emotional landscapes of life in a changing world. Here is part 2, Changes.
My name is Annika Ord, and I'm a master's student in geography at the University of British Columbia. This is a reading from my reflection on scientists and feelings in the climate crisis. I'm sitting outside in the sun writing this reflection. It's February 7th, but it feels like a day in late March or early April. The sun holds heat. My hands are not cold typing, and the birds sound as though they're celebrating, or at least have a lot to say. Another moment of seasonal disorientation. It feels common now, these days superimposed from another season. Today, I celebrate the chance to work in February outdoors, to sit in my thoughts without the cloistering of walls and distraction of internet tabs. Outside with the world is my favorite way to be. But still, this day feels misplaced in the season. A voice tells me I should feel concern. The last few weeks I felt a kind of whiplash, or I might call it geographic disorientation. The return to screens, city grids, and Zoom meetings contrast sharply with my last month at home in Alaska, playing in snow, shoveling overburdened roofs, caring for boats and a dad with a replaced knee, feeling deeply connected to the place that is my home. But it's more than that. The sense of disorientation grows as I read of powerful climate emotions and data sets of loss, while learning through a screen that seems to reinforce the disconnection from the earth that I've come here to question. And it makes me wonder if the ways in which we teach and learn, work, and interact with the world mediated through a screen are reinforced by this great divide. The divide that allows us to emotionally detach and stand by as our only home and our very existence hangs in a balance that is rapidly deteriorating. So here I sit, outside in a day that feels unreasonably warm, to write while being a part of a world that includes, but is so much bigger than human. The readings this week felt familiar and personal. I appreciated the words of Genevieve Gunther, to write from a place that is both tangible and local, and build outwards from there. I found the letters from the scientists who spoke from their own experience of climate change, from a place of emotional vulnerability and through story, to be the most moving. For some time I've been trying to share in this way. I am practicing now. And it is comforting to hear the words of others doing the same. Ariane Purich's letter gave me pause. She spoke of terror for the world her children would inherit, but also the world of today. It makes me reflect on a thought I've had before. Will our own homes need to be the ones that are burning or flooding before we are shaken awake? I hope not. I'm having a moment buoyed by this outdoor writing. I imagine classrooms and congresses, gatherings of world leaders held outdoors, observing the songbirds and lichen, making carbon emission commitments beneath rolling heat waves, lining up for water deliveries when aquifers run dry, hauling sandbags in relentless rain, learning how to find and pick fiddleheads in spring. I imagine this from a place of both love and rage. I appreciate the practical advice of Genevieve Gunther. Fight the people in power, not the disembodied force of climate change. I think of the words of my advisor, Michelle Copez, shared with me, that we must bring our whole selves to this work. It is heartening and energizing to hear from others like Rachel Carson, Kim Cobb, and Joelle Gargis, who recognize the power of emotion to move people to action.
My name is Ruth Moore. I am a geophysics master's student in the Department of Earth, Ocean and Atmospheric Sciences at UBC. I research how climate change is impacting precipitation, such as rain and snow, in the Canadian Arctic. It's October 2nd, 2022. My friend Thanky and I decided to go on a gravel ride towards Bunsen Lake. We spent most of the summer cycling around the Lower Mainland and Vancouver Island, everywhere from the Sunshine Coast to the Cowichan Valley. We would bike pack, where we packed up our belongings and embarked on 2- and 3-night self-propelled adventures around this beautiful place that we get to call home. Worries related to ecological breakdown are easier to manage when it's just you, a friend, a tent, and some bear spray against the elements. On this particular day, we decided to go out and explore somewhere a little closer to home in order to enjoy the uncharacteristically mild autumn weather we were having before the foreshadowed rain closed in. This was planned to be an overall mood-boosting, head-clearing, adrenaline-rushing end to a week of working indoors. When I woke up that morning, I felt a strange sense of heaviness in the air and a density that I had not noticed before. As we ventured closer to Coquitlam, we noticed that the air was smelling smoky with a strange haze over the water. The mountains were getting harder to see. It was a wildfire of a nondescript human cause, a fire which would eventually halt our cycling plans for the day and require over 20 firefighters to tend to a blaze which at times was out of control. Where I am from, we do have wildfires, but it's nothing to the extent of what we get here in BC, and certainly not in October, which is meant to be a wet and saturated month. The air was hot and heavy and began to close in. With the visibility lowering and in an attempt to protect our lungs, we got the SkyTrain back to Vancouver, where the smoke had not yet arrived. In the readings for this class, we had heard of stories of people from communities which were affected by forest fires, and specifically the ways in which individuals are learning to cope with the heaviness. We explored and discussed how climate change is affecting our mental health. The ability to stay cool and calm is being decreased, and individuals everywhere are becoming more overwhelmed with the impending reality that we all face. The ability to calmly choose to take the train back to breathable air quality and remove oneself from the situation is not the case for those who have experienced devastating forest fires in their regions. It is therefore difficult to reconcile with the concept of climate anxiety, since this is not just something which is happening in the mind, it is tangible, here for us to feel mentally and physically.
This is On the Bus by Nina Sky Robertson. On the bus, I read the Grantham Institute's report about the impact of climate change on mental health and emotional well-being. My phone's blue light penetrates my eyes, and nausea almost overcomes me as the vehicle jostles forward. I eat a piece of raw ginger to soothe my stomach, focusing on the burning sensation under my tongue. Although I'm reading, my headphones are in. I'm trying to block my sensitive nervous system from being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of stimulus on the bus. All those smells, all those tiny, beautiful moments and interactions between strangers, all those days and hopes and worries playing out on people's faces. I'm reminded of a vignette Sally Wintrobe uses in her book Psychological Roots of the Climate Crisis to introduce systems of care. In the scene, tension rises between a disabled man and a young father on a bus just like this. I wonder what it would look like to create a system of care that supported people like me, people who are extremely sensitive, to ride the bus or adequately deal with climate change. Although later I would learn that sensitivity can result from trauma, then I understood my sensitivity as a kind of mental health death sentence, or as the precursor to the psychiatric melodies which haunt me. For as long as I can remember, the distinction between myself and others has felt quite thin. In a world plagued by inequalities, extraction, and abuse, by the cruelty of capitalism and the permutations of trauma, disconnection, dissociation, and unmeaning, being hyper-aware is a difficult state to maintain without dipping into periods of personal suffering, fugue states of overwhelm. The Grantham Report and Sally Wintrobe's book ask, when it comes to climate change, is that suffering not rational? But for my seat, as someone with what the report calls pre-existing mental illness, I wonder if my sensitivity-induced experience has ever been unrational. It's not a gripe or a criticism, but a statement of appreciation for discourse broaching collectivity. Systems of care designed to support the sensitive, ill, or disabled will be better equipped to support us all. It is a well-known design phenomena called the curb cut effect. And so it is no wonder that the Institute's #1 recommendation may be boiled down to take action on climate change itself in order to deal with the emerging climate-related mental health crises. I cry as we jostle through Railtown and along Powell. I feel strangely seen by the legalistic call to action. I've often felt gaslit by those better able to direct their attention and modulate their emotional intensity, for my concerns over climate change, for my worries about how systems fail people and how trauma is folded through generations. This is the first time I've encountered a narrative that describes my experience as a rational reaction to a world gone awry, rather than a personal or biological deficiency, and it feels good and true to be understood as an organism who lives in relation with the world. The driver turns a blind eye to a woman who smells of oranges and gets on the bus through the back door, while a man in a thin coat shouts his thanks and thumps the window next to me.
My name is Felix Giroux, and this is a reading from my reflective essay. On October 28, 2021, already 3 years ago, Lord Stern gave a talk to celebrate 15 years since he published his well-known report, The Economics of Climate Change, the Stern Review. In the conference hall, there weren't a lot of people as we were all spaced out 2 meters apart. I sat in the back thinking I was just there to listen, take notes, and prepare for COP26, which was a few weeks away. His talk was full of newspeak and quote-unquote bank speak, promoting the idea that innovation, growth, investments, and global shifts will solve the problem of GHG emissions. He ended his presentation on the hope that young people gave him, referring to Fridays for the Future and other youth activist groups, mostly from the global north. At that moment, I couldn't understand how he connected innovation, investment, and youth as the solutions to the climate crisis. In what world does bank speak and rebellion against bank speak make sense? One of the first questions came from a student, wondering if and how capitalism was responsible and how his models accounted for radical systems change. He brushed the answer off, replying that we didn't have time to change the system. I raised my hand. I asked something along the lines of, how dare you use young climate activists as a solution for the future in your slides, alongside mainstream capitalist ideas of investment and innovation, as young people or politics are the opposite of what you've just presented. At least that's what I was trying to express. His reply was a short lecture on Amartya Sen's definition of justice, not answering my question at all. After his talk, I walked up to him to ask if he would accept a meeting at COP26 with youth climate activists so they could express their climate politics and understandings of climate justice. He refused, stating that he was too busy at COP meeting with world leaders. This was supposed to be a climate champion, heralded by mainstream environmentalists and the UK government for his work on climate economics. The climate crisis doesn't come from one single source, GHG emissions. It's the symptom of larger problems like capitalism and colonialism. We can't just put a price on carbon and expect the market to solve it. I think back on this moment and I'm realizing I should have grieved. Grieve for the system that I wish we could have. Grieve for the change Stern is refusing. Grieve for loss. Loss of words, loss of understanding, loss of solidarity, our loss.
We'll end the episode with 2 readings from an assignment to rename what is often called the Anthropocene, to put our own ideas into the name of this moment of living on a damaged and unequal planet. Here is part 3, Names for a New Age.
Howdy, my name is Melissa Plisic, and I do work in critical animal studies and queer ecologies. This is an excerpt from my poem, The Age of Sanctuary. Welcome to the Age of Sanctuary. Searching for sanctuary means you've been dealing with some serious shit. Refuge is good, but short term. Plus, I want to avoid the ricochets of xenophobia that one extra E makes. Refugees have human rights. Sanctuaries have something less flimsy. Sanctuary is sacred. Unlike Eden, you are never alone, even if you are the only Homo sapiens sapiens. It means you breathe with the community that holds you. The age of sanctuary is beyond time. Always already happening, always a possibility, exists independent of you, exists within you if you know where to look. Never the same way twice. Eluding time to catch it is to be profoundly present. Sanctuary does not ask for hope when quieting a frantic heart. Does not ask you to pretend to be okay. Sanctuary is where you can lick your wounds and gather strength for the task at hand. This summer, I visited Toronto for the first time for the North American Association for Critical Animal Studies first biennial meeting on extinction. 3 extraordinary days of preaching to the choir, 3 attendees under 30 and queer, a recipe for instant friendship, and a crush or 2. On Saturday morning before my flight, I invited them to Allen Gardens Conservatory, a 10-minute walk from the Holiday Inn Express, Toronto downtown. Let's look at all these exotic plants that need constant watering and pruning and probably heating had it not been mid-August. I was skeptical, but ultimately a tourist. And I had smoked a joint outside waiting for my friends while listening to the cicadas, so at least I was enjoying it. But also resisting the urge to tell my new comrades that, despite the greenhouse's illusion of outdoorness, inside voices would be more appropriate. I walked ahead to passively look for some peace and quiet, turned the corner to find a small koi pond, all green with dots and slashes of red. Beneath a stone statue of a nude maiden holding a pitcher mid-pour, gazing at her duck friend, the duck gazing back. The koi looked small compared to those I usually see outdoors, but these koi, these were babies, some actual babies. Feeling magic, I was consumed by the pond for a moment with a white woman a generation or two older than me, then a black man a generation or two older than me, wearing an Allen Gardens t-shirt, dirty jeans, and work boots came over and started talking to the fish, himself, the woman, me, nobody, all of the above. He said that in the 17 years of working there, taking care of this pond, this was the first time there had been baby koi. He told them how happy he was to see them, how proud he was of them, how much he loved them. He was so taken by these koi, radiating so much awe, that my friends who caught up finally shut up. Then he told them he'd be back soon and went on his day. My friends were more attuned after that.
Hi, I'm Maggie O'Donnell. I'm a master's student in geography, and I study urban environmental politics. This is part of my essay, Age of Tehom. When God began to create the heavens and the earth was complete chaos, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. Since the 2nd century, Christian theologians have used the first verses of the book of Genesis to advance the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, or creation from nothing. On this basis, the beginning begins with God, ascribing order and form where there was chaos and creating light where it was formerly dark. The supremacy of order and lightness was reinforced in subsequent centuries, at the expense of the deep, translated from the Hebrew Tehom, and those identified with the feminine, dark, or mystical other. When I considered how I could intervene productively in the ongoing conversations about the Anthropocene, I turned to the relationship Western society has with Tehom, as both a possible origin point for chronicling our current unfolding ecological crisis, and also as a place to look to now for a potential source of a new beginning. By embracing the Tehomic waters of the primordial moment, along with the ways those who embody its depths continue to resist erasure, we might start to imagine a collective path towards a different future. The relegation of Tehom to the edges of the creation story, God creates and there's no looking back, sparked a pattern of violent oppression and marginalization repeated throughout Western Europe's pursuit to control the globe. As Whitney Bowman cogently argues in his chapter, Creatio ex nihilo and the erasure of presence, the doctrine of creation ex nihilo directly informed the colonial legal concept of terra nullius, by allowing European colonizers to justify their suppression and annihilation of indigenous peoples as part of a larger ordained mission to spread order and eradicate chaos. These histories all feed, and as a result, sustain, what theologian Catherine Keller refers to as Western Christianity's dominology. Keller elaborated on this dominology, stating, "Appropriation and annihilation comprise the twin idols of dominology, the engines by which the denigrated chaos, its people, its species, gets reduced either to raw stuff for use or simply to nothing." From the exploitation of migrant farm workers expected to toil in extreme heat to the proliferation of sacrifice zones in racialized communities along Louisiana's Cancer Alley, these engines of dominology continue into the present, fueling cultural destruction and ecological collapse. For those with dark, mysterious, disordered, feminine, or otherwise Tehomic qualities, these devices of dominology compound into a constant, crushing weight. This is not to say those who have been consigned to the depths, including various Tehomic human and more than human kin, are powerless in resisting the hegemonic structures of oppression. In fact, the hard-fought successes won by indigenous peoples fighting for land repatriation and young people engaged in intersectional climate justice protests, demanding government accountability, illustrate best the fissures in settler colonial dominology. Our collective relationship to Tehom will determine how we face the future. We can turn to the space colonizers, lab meat moguls, and carbon credit financiers to sweep down and blow their winds of technocratic climate solutions over the face of our unfolding polycrises. Or we could dive into the Tehom, swim in the depths, lose track of where our limbs, swirling and kicking, end, and where the waters begin. We could begin the story of a new age with one that is very old, one that humbly invites you to consider finding threads of even earlier cosmologies within its layers and shadows, an origin story that welcomes an infinity of origin stories.
We'd like to thank all of the students who contributed their work to this episode, and everyone in the Ecological Affect class whose thoughtful ideas fostered such generative discussion and meaningful writing. Thanks also to Kendra Jewell, Audrey Irvine Broke, Laura Steichen, and Maggie O'Donnell for their support in reviewing drafts of this audio story. Finally, we'd like to thank the University of British Columbia's Hampton Grant Program for funding work on this project. Now, make sure to listen to the second and final episode in this series, Eulogies. Thanks for listening.